Stop! He's already dead! The fire chief's voice cut through the chaos of the collapsed building. Sarah Martinez looked up from where she knelt beside the motionless construction worker, her hands still pressed against his chest. Around her, rescue workers were shaking their heads, some already turning away. "Ma'am, he's been down for 12 minutes, another firefighter said, his tone gentle but firm. "There's no pulse, no breathing. We need to focus on the ones we can still save." Sarah felt their eyes on her, watching the stubborn paramedic who refused to accept what everyone else could see. They didn't know about the classified techniques she'd learned during her 3 tours as an Army combat medic in Afghanistan. They didn't know about the experimental resuscitation protocols she'd used in field hospitals where giving up meant watching soldiers die. In their world, 12 minutes without a heartbeat meant death. In her world, it meant you hadn't tried everything yet. What happened next would change everything at that disaster site, and if you want to see how Sarah proves everyone wrong using a technique that defies conventional medicine, make sure you subscribe to Emergency Heroes Stories. Because what she does in the next few minutes will challenge everything you think you know about life and death. Where are you watching from? The technique she was about to use was something most paramedics had never even heard of. Something that would make seasoned doctors question everything they thought they knew about resuscitation. The apartment building had collapsed at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, trapping dozens of residents and construction workers in a maze of concrete and twisted steel. Sarah had been first on scene, her ambulance screaming through downtown Phoenix as reports crackled over the radio about multiple casualties and people trapped in the rubble. Now, 30 minutes later, the disaster site looked like a war zone. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the sound of heavy machinery mixed with shouting voices and the occasional cry for help from somewhere deep in the debris. Sarah had pulled 3 survivors from the wreckage already, but this one was different. Marcus Chen, according to his coworker who'd been pulled out conscious, was 28 years old with a wife and twin daughters. He'd been operating a jackhammer on the 3rd floor when the building came down. They'd found him buried under a concrete beam, his body still and cold. "Sarah, come on." Jake Rodriguez, her partner for the past 2 years, touched her shoulder. "He's gone. We've got 2 more victims over there who need immediate attention." She ignored him, her fingers moving to check the man's carotid artery one more time. Nothing. His skin had that waxy pallor she'd seen too many times before, and his lips were blue. By every medical standard she'd learned in paramedic school, Marcus Chen was dead. But something nagged at her. The way his body was positioned, the pattern of debris around him, the fact that his airway seemed clear despite being buried. In Kandahar, she'd learned to read signs that others missed. She'd learned that sometimes death wasn't final, even when it looked hopeless. The fire chief, a gruff man named Bill Harrison, walked over with heavy steps. "Martinez, I need you to call it. We've got limited resources here, and there are people we can actually save." Sarah looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce. "Give me 3 more minutes." "Sarah, he's been down for 15 minutes now. Even if we got him back, the brain damage would be 3 minutes." Her voice carried an authority that made Harrison pause. Something in her tone reminded him of military medics he'd worked with before, the ones who'd seen things that changed how they looked at life and death. The crowd of rescue workers had grown. Firefighters, EMTs, even some of the survivors they'd already pulled out were watching. Sarah could feel their doubt, their mixture of pity and frustration. The stubborn paramedic who couldn't accept reality. She positioned her hands differently on Marcus's chest, not in the standard CPR position, but slightly lower and angled. Her thumbs pressed into specific points along his ribs, pressure points she'd learned from a Special Forces medic in a forward operating base outside Kabul. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling for something others couldn't sense. In Afghanistan, they'd called it battlefield medicine, but the technique had roots that went back centuries. She'd only used it twice before, both times on soldiers who'd been declared dead by field medics. Her hands began moving in a specific pattern, applying pressure in a sequence that looked nothing like standard resuscitation. It was a combination of compression points, precise timing, and something that bordered on desperation wrapped in scientific precision. "This is ridiculous," she heard someone mutter. The first phase of the technique involved stimulating specific nerve clusters that could, in theory, restart electrical activity in a heart that had been silent too long. Sarah's hands moved like she was playing an invisible piano, each touch calculated to send signals through Marcus's nervous system. Jake knelt beside her. "Sarah, what are you doing? This isn't anything we learned in school." "I learned it in the army," she said without looking up, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead. "Sometimes the textbook isn't enough." She moved to the second phase, a series of compressions that followed ancient pressure points combined with modern understanding of cardiac physiology. Her instructor in Afghanistan had called it battlefield resurrection, though he'd made them swear never to use the term in official reports. The crowd was getting restless. Some were shaking their heads openly now. A few had started to walk away, convinced they were watching a paramedic have some kind of breakdown. But Sarah felt something, a flutter, barely perceptible, under her fingertips. Something that might have been muscle memory, might have been wishful thinking, might have been the beginning of a miracle. She pressed harder, following the sequence exactly as she'd been taught. Third phase now, the most critical part. This was where the technique either worked or confirmed what everyone else already believed. Marcus's chest was still motionless under her hands, but Sarah had learned to trust her instincts over her eyes. In the chaos of combat medicine, she'd discovered that sometimes life hung on by threads so thin that only the most desperate measures could pull it back. Octor. The silence stretched for another 30 seconds, and Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on her. Chief Harrison cleared his throat, ready to call it official, when something impossible happened. A sound so quiet it was almost imagined. A whisper of air that might have been the wind through the debris, except it came from Marcus Chen's lips. Sarah's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Jake leaned closer, his skepticism warring with hope. She pressed her ear to Marcus's chest, her hand still maintaining the pressure sequence she'd learned in a tent hospital half a world away. There it was again. Not a heartbeat exactly, but something. A flutter of electrical activity that her portable monitor hadn't been sensitive enough to detect. "Get me the advanced monitor from the truck," she ordered, her voice sharp with sudden urgency. Jake hesitated. "Sarah, I don't think—" "Now!" He ran toward their ambulance while Sarah continued the technique. Around her, the crowd had gone completely silent. Even the construction of rescue operations seemed to pause as everyone watched the paramedic who refused to give up. The advanced cardiac monitor showed what her hands had already told her. Weak, irregular, but unmistakably there. Electrical activity in Marcus's heart. Not enough to sustain life, not even close to normal, but present when minutes ago there had been nothing. "Jesus," Harrison breathed. "How is that possible?" Sarah didn't answer. She was moving into the fourth phase of the technique, the most dangerous part. This was where she either brought Marcus back or lost him permanently. The electrical activity was just the beginning. Now she had to convince his heart to actually pump blood. Her hands moved to new positions, applying pressure in a rhythm that seemed chaotic to observers, but followed a precise pattern designed to mimic the heart's natural electrical pathways. She'd only seen this work once before, on a Marine who'd taken shrapnel to the chest outside Helmand Province. "Come on, Marcus," she whispered. "Your girls need you to fight." The monitor began showing more organized activity. Still weak, still irregular, but becoming more coherent with each compression. Sarah could feel the change in his chest cavity, the subtle shift that meant circulation was trying to restart. "I need epinephrine now," she called out. An EMT from another unit rushed forward with the drug. Sarah administered it directly into Marcus's chest, following the injection with more of the specialized compressions. For a moment, nothing changed. The crowd held its breath, and Sarah felt doubt creeping in for the first time. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was just wishful thinking combined with outdated techniques that had no place in modern medicine. Then Marcus Chen's eyes fluttered open. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. Harrison took a step backward, his face pale. That's impossible. He was dead. I mean, clinically dead for almost 20 minutes. Sarah was already moving, transitioning from the experimental technique to standard emergency care. "I need a stretcher. oxygen, and IV access. He's back, but he's not stable. Marcus's eyes found hers, confused and unfocused but undeniably alive. His lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear. "Don't try to talk," she told him gently. "You've been through something incredible. Just breathe." As they loaded Marcus onto the stretcher, Jake grabbed Sarah's arm. "What the hell was that? That's not any technique I've ever seen." "The military medicine," she said simply. "Sometimes we had to try things that weren't in the civilian playbook." But even as she said it, Sarah knew it was more than that. The technique she'd used wasn't just military training. It was a combination of ancient knowledge and modern desperation, something that lived in the gray area between accepted medicine and miracle. What would you have done in Sarah's position? When everyone tells you to give up, when every protocol says it's over, how do you decide when to keep fighting? Tell us in the comments. As the ambulance raced toward the hospital, Marcus's vital signs slowly stabilized. He was far from out of danger, but he was alive when everyone had written him off. Sarah sat beside him, monitoring his condition and wondering if she'd just witnessed a medical miracle or simply applied science that was too advanced for most people to understand. The radio crackled with updates from the disaster site. More survivors were being found and the rescue operation was expanding. But Sarah's mind was on the technique she'd just used, on the fine line between life and death, and on the responsibility that came with knowledge others didn't possess. Marcus squeezed her hand weakly, and she realized that whatever questions she had about the ethics and science of what she'd done would have to wait. Right now, a man was alive who shouldn't have been, and that was enough. Satoriam. The emergency department at Phoenix General was already overwhelmed when their ambulance arrived. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, met them at the door with a team of residents and nurses, her face grim as she listened to Sarah's initial report. 23 minutes down? Dr. Walsh's eyebrows shot up. "That's not possible. Brain death occurs after—" "I know what the textbooks say," Sarah interrupted, helping transfer Marcus to the hospital gurney. "But his neurological responses are intact. Pupils reactive, follow simple commands, no obvious cognitive deficits." Dr. Walsh began her examination, clearly skeptical but thorough. As she worked, Marcus's vital signs continued to improve. His blood pressure was low but stable, his heart rhythm was becoming more regular, and most importantly, he was responding appropriately to questions. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Walsh muttered. "Even if he survived the cardiac arrest, 23 minutes without circulation should have caused massive brain damage." Sarah watched from the corner of the trauma bay, still trying to process what had happened herself. The technique she'd used wasn't magic, but it challenged everything most medical professionals believed about the limits of resuscitation. A nurse approached her. "The patient wants to talk to you." Marcus's voice was weak but clear when she reached his bedside. "You didn't give up on me." "It's my job," Sarah said simply. "Everyone else did. I could hear them, you know. Even when I couldn't respond, I could hear them saying I was gone." His eyes filled with tears. "My wife, my daughters. I thought I'd never see them again." Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled. Chief Harrison's voice came through, tight with urgency. "All units, we've got another collapse in Sector 7. Multiple casualties, and we've got someone trapped in a similar situation to the Chen rescue." Sarah looked at Dr. Walsh, who was still reviewing Marcus's test results with a bewildered expression. "Go," the doctor said. "Whatever you did out there, if someone else needs it." The ride back to the disaster site felt surreal. Jake kept glancing at her, clearly struggling with questions he didn't know how to ask. "Sarah, that technique, is it something they taught all Army medics?" "No," she said quietly. "It was specialized training. Not everyone got it, and not everyone could handle it." "Handle it how?" Sarah stared out the windshield at the dusty Phoenix skyline. "Because sometimes you save someone everyone else had given up on, and sometimes you fail anyway. The weight of that knowledge, of knowing you might be someone's last hope, it changes you." When they arrived back at the disaster site, Sarah could see the situation immediately. A woman in her 50s was trapped under debris similar to what had pinned Marcus, and the same grim expressions were on the rescue workers' faces. "She's been down for 18 minutes," Harrison told Sarah as she approached. "No pulse, no respiratory effort." Sarah knelt beside the victim, a woman whose ID identified her as Elena Vasquez, a teacher at the local elementary school. The familiar weight of impossible expectations settled on her shoulders. Around her, she could hear whispers. Word had already spread about Marcus Chen's impossible resurrection. Some of the rescue workers were looking at her with something approaching awe, while others seemed skeptical that lightning could strike twice. "Can you do it again?" a young EMT asked quietly. Sarah placed her hands on Elena's chest, feeling for the subtle signs that had guided her with Marcus. Every case was different. Every body responded uniquely to trauma, but the basic principles remained the same. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I'm going to try." The technique began the same way, with the precise pressure points that could theoretically restart electrical activity in a silent heart. But as Sarah worked, she realized that Elena's condition was different from Marcus's. The pattern of her injuries, the way her body had been compressed by the debris, the amount of time that had passed, all variables that might affect the outcome. This time, she had an audience that believed in miracles, which somehow made the pressure even greater. If she failed now, it would raise questions about Marcus's recovery. Had that been a fluke? A misdiagnosis of death rather than a true resurrection? Sarah pushed the doubts away and focused on what her hands were telling her. Elena's body was fighting her, the cellular damage more extensive than Marcus's had been. But there was something there, a spark of possibility that kept her going. The crowd around her had grown larger. Word was spreading through the disaster site about the paramedic who could bring people back from the dead. Sarah could feel their expectations, their hope, their need to believe that death wasn't always final. But medicine wasn't magic, and even the most advanced techniques had limits. 15 minutes later, Sarah finally stopped. Elena Vasquez remained motionless, her body unresponsive to every technique Sarah had tried. The specialized pressure points, the electrical stimulation, the combination of ancient wisdom and modern medicine, none of it had worked this time. The silence that followed was different from the awed quiet after Marcus's recovery. This was the heavy silence of disappointment, of hopes raised and then crushed. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, looking up at the circle of rescue workers. "Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't." Chief Harrison placed a hand on her shoulder. "You tried. That's more than most would have done." But Sarah could see the questions in their eyes. If she could save Marcus, why not Elena? What made one person recoverable and another truly gone? The truth was that she didn't fully understand it herself. As they covered Elena's body and prepared to continue the search for other survivors, Sarah felt the familiar weight of battlefield medicine settling back on her shoulders. In Afghanistan, she'd learned that saving lives sometimes meant accepting that you couldn't save them all. A news crew had arrived at the disaster site, drawn by reports of the miracle recovery. Sarah watched them interviewing witnesses, saw them gesturing toward where Marcus had been found, and felt a familiar discomfort with the attention. "Martinez," a reporter called out, "can you tell us about the technique you used to save Marcus Chen?" Sarah shook her head and kept walking toward her ambulance. The last thing she wanted was to turn life-saving medicine into a media circus. The technique she'd used was real, but it wasn't magic, and she didn't want desperate families getting false hope. Her radio crackled again. Another victim had been found, this one still conscious but trapped under a concrete beam. Standard rescue, standard medicine, the kind she'd been trained for in civilian paramedic school. But as she worked to stabilize the new patient, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that word about Marcus Chen's recovery was going to spread. Other paramedics would ask questions, doctors would want to know details, and eventually, someone would want her to teach the technique she'd learned in a war zone. The problem was that the technique couldn't be taught from a textbook. It required intuition, experience with trauma that most civilian medics would never see, and a willingness to try things that existed in the gray areas of medical knowledge. "You okay?" Jake asked as they transported their latest patient to the hospital. "Just thinking about Elena," Sarah lied. The truth was more complicated. She was thinking about the weight of having knowledge that others didn't, about the responsibility that came with techniques that existed outside normal protocols. In the Army, there had been clear chains of command, classified procedures, and understanding that some medical knowledge stayed within military circles. But this was different. Marcus Chen's family would want answers. The medical community would have questions. And somewhere out there, other disaster victims might die because their paramedics didn't know what Sarah knew. When they reached the hospital, Dr. Walsh met them again, but her attention was clearly divided. "How's Marcus?" Sarah asked. "Remarkable recovery. All his tests are coming back normal, which should be impossible given what he went through." Dr. Walsh paused. "I've been thinking about what you did out there. That technique, I'd like to know more about it." Sarah felt the walls starting to close in. "It's not something that can be easily explained, but it saved a life. Shouldn't other medical professionals know about it?" Before Sarah could answer, Marcus Chen's wife appeared in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. She rushed to Sarah and wrapped her in a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "The doctors told me what you did, how everyone else had given up. Thank you for not giving up on him." Over the woman's shoulder, Sarah could see Dr. Walsh watching, her expression thoughtful. This was how it started. One save, one family's gratitude, and suddenly everyone wanted to know the secret. But some secrets existed for reasons that went beyond medical knowledge. The technique Sarah had used came with psychological costs, with the weight of decisions that civilian medicine wasn't designed to handle. How do you balance saving lives with protecting the people who might try to save them? When knowledge could help some but might harm others, where's the line between sharing and keeping secrets? What would you do in Sarah's position? As Marcus's wife finally released her, Sarah realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her career. She could walk away, return to standard protocols, and let Marcus Chen remain a one-time miracle. Or she could step forward into a world where she became known as the paramedic who could bring people back from the dead, with all the expectations and responsibilities that would bring. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in the conference room at Phoenix General Hospital, facing a panel of doctors, administrators, and EMS supervisors. Word about Marcus Chen's recovery had indeed spread, and now everyone wanted answers. Dr. Walsh led the discussion, her tone professional but curious. "Sarah, we've reviewed Marcus's case extensively. By every medical standard we understand, his recovery should have been impossible. We need to know exactly what technique you used." Sarah looked around the table at the expectant faces. She'd spent the past 2 weeks thinking about this moment, weighing the benefits of sharing knowledge against the risks of putting that knowledge in the wrong hands. "The technique I used combined several elements," she began carefully. "Pressure point stimulation based on traditional Chinese medicine, modified cardiac compression techniques, and electrical pathway manipulation that I learned from Special Forces medics." Dr. Patricia Morrison, the hospital's chief of cardiology, leaned forward. "Can you demonstrate these techniques? Train others to use them?" "That's complicated," Sarah said. "The technique isn't just about hand placement or compression sequences. It requires intuition about tissue damage, understanding of electrical pathways that aren't taught in standard medical training, and—" She paused, struggling to explain the indefinable element that made the difference between success and failure. "And?" Dr. Walsh prompted. "And acceptance that sometimes you'll try everything and still lose someone. The psychological weight of that responsibility isn't something everyone can handle." Marcus Chen had made a full recovery with no apparent neurological damage, an outcome that had baffled every specialist who examined him. But Elena Vasquez remained dead, and Sarah carried both outcomes with equal weight. Chief Harrison spoke up from the end of the table. "What we need to know is whether this technique can be standardized, taught, and implemented in our EMS protocols." Sarah shook her head. "It can't be standardized because every situation is different. The technique works on reading subtle signs that most people can't detect, making split-second decisions based on information that isn't visible on monitors. But surely the basic principles could be taught," Dr. Morrison insisted. "The basic principles, maybe. But without the experience to know when to apply them, when to stop, and how to live with the outcomes, you'd be setting people up for failure." The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. They were asking her to teach something that couldn't really be taught, to standardize something that existed in the realm of intuition and experience. Dr. Walsh finally spoke. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that some medical knowledge exists in gray areas for good reasons," Sarah said. "The technique I used on Marcus saved his life, but it also failed to save Elena's. If you start teaching it to paramedics who haven't had the psychological preparation to handle those failures, you'll create more problems than you solve. So you're saying this technique should remain, what, secret?" Sarah thought about her combat medic training, about the classified techniques that had saved lives in Afghanistan, but were too dangerous for civilian use without proper context. "I'm saying it should remain specialized, available for specific situations, used by people who understand the full implications, but not part of standard protocols." The meeting ended with more questions than answers. The medical community wanted scientific explanations for what appeared to be miraculous, but some aspects of battlefield medicine couldn't be reduced to textbook procedures. 3 months later, Sarah received a call that would change everything again. The Department of Defense was starting a new program, training civilian paramedics in advanced techniques for disaster response and mass casualty events. They wanted her to help design the curriculum. As she sat in her apartment, looking at the official invitation, Sarah realized that the question wasn't whether to share what she knew. The question was how to share it responsibly, with the proper training and psychological support that would allow others to carry the weight of life and death decisions. Marcus Chen sent her a photo every month, pictures of him with his twin daughters, moments that wouldn't have existed if she had accepted everyone else's judgment that he was beyond saving. But she also thought about Elena Vasquez's family, and about all the future Elenas who might die while paramedics tried techniques they weren't fully prepared to use. The balance between knowledge and responsibility was delicate, but Sarah had learned in the Army that some burdens were too important to carry alone. The question was finding people strong enough to share them. Outside her window, Phoenix's evening light spread across the valley like scattered stars. Somewhere out there, emergency responders were making life and death decisions, working with the tools and knowledge they had. Sarah picked up the phone to call the Department of Defense. It was time to make sure they had better tools and deeper knowledge, taught with the wisdom that came from understanding both the power to save lives and the weight of carrying that power. Some techniques couldn't be learned from books, but they could be passed on by people who understood what it meant to hold life and death in their hands. And sometimes that was enough to make the difference between giving up and trying one more time. The story of Marcus Chen's impossible recovery would become legend in EMS circles. But Sarah knew the real story was more complex. It was about the gray areas of medicine, the weight of knowledge, and the responsibility that came with refusing to give up when everyone else had already walked away. And in hospital break rooms and ambulance stations across the country, paramedics would continue to debate the same question that had haunted Sarah since that day in the rubble. When do you stop fighting? And when do you keep trying techniques that exist beyond the edge of accepted medicine? The answer, Sarah had learned, wasn't in any textbook. It was in the hands that refused to stop, the hearts that wouldn't accept defeat, and the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge others didn't possess.